Hello.
I got up out of the sick bed to come because I knew you'd be kicking my ass. The rest of the I weren't here. And I wasn't in a sick bed. I said that for effect.
Ready?
Hello. Okay, hello everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Krishna. Amazing when you do it.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I,
I have lost the sound.
None of y'all will be in any of his films, so cut that shit out.
okay, so welcome everyone to today's colloquium. And we're very much looking forward to Martha Patterson's presentation on mapping Arabelle Thompson from the Jazz Age Prairie to Cold War Africa. She will be introduced by George Hutchinson, who is the Newton C. Farr Professor of American Culture and the George Reed Professor of Writing and Rhetoric at Cornell University. His scholarly and teaching specializations are 19th and 20th century American literature, American racial culture, and more recently, literary ecology. A prolific and award-winning author, his most recent book is Facing the Abyss, American Literature and Culture in the 1940s. His other highly acclaimed works include In Search of Nella Larson, a biography of the color line, and The Harlem Renaissance in Black and White, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in History. Professor Hutchinson's works in progress include a memoir of well digging in Burkina Faso and a biography, Gene Tumor, An American Life. So please welcome George Hutchinson on the screen.
Thank you, Kristen.
Hello, George.
Hi there. And thank you to whoever's idea it was to invite me to introduce this. I'm looking forward to the lecture. I'm speaking here from my office, one of my offices at Cornell. So Professor Martha H. Patterson currently holds a Hutchins Family Fellowship in the Hutchins Center, where she also held a Ford Foundation Fellowship in 2020 to 21. She's a professor of English at McKendree University, where she has spent most of her career, albeit with a year-long Fulbright lecturer position at the University of Agder, Kristiansand, Norway, in 2010 to 11. Her career has been devoted to studying the rhetoric of the new in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in the periodical press. Using a wide range of digitized texts and archival sources, she examines how historically oppressed groups rebranded themselves in their struggle for full civil rights. Early in her career, she addressed the phenomenon of the new woman, most notably in her book Beyond the Gibson Girl, Reimagining the American New Woman, 1895 to 1915, which was published by the University of Illinois Press in 2005 and came out in paperback in 2008. Also in 2008, she published the oft-cited anthology, The American New Woman Revisited, a Reader, 1894 to 1930, with Rutgers University Press. Patterson's most recent work focuses on the new Negro, which she terms, quote, the first and longest-lasting media campaign in American history that worked to combat the brutality of anti-Black propaganda. With Professor Gates, she's the editor of an ambitious new anthology, The New Negro, A History and Documents, 1887 and 1937, for which she wrote an excellent introduction. I had the pleasure of reading that for the press not too long ago, actually. That book is in proofs and will appear from Princeton University Press this year. I find it a remarkably wide-ranging compendium of writing and illustration about Black life and modernity that is, at the same time, a history of the trope of the new Negro from 2 generations before the Harlem Renaissance to the brink of World War II. Professor Patterson's introduction offers a valuable analytical account, bringing contemporary perspectives of Black internationalism, Black feminism, and class analysis to bear on the gathered material. It's a wonderful resource for anyone interested in Black cultural history. Also forthcoming this year from Cambridge University Press is Patterson's monograph, Harlem Renaissance Weekly, Reading the New Negro Movement in the 1920s Black Newspapers, which promises to open up new perspectives on the movement by attending to its presence and coverage in the papers which so many Black readers read or subscribed to. I very much look forward to reading it. Her lecture this afternoon on a longtime editor and journalist for Ebony magazine is entitled Mapping Arabelle Thompson from the Jazz Age Midwest to Cold War Africa. Thank you, and welcome, Professor Patterson.
Will you be watching?
Yes.
Okay. Well, George, we'll ask you to ask the first question.
Thank you all for coming today. I would like to begin by thanking Liesl Olson, who in 2022 led a fascinating seminar at the NEH Institute on the Chicago modernism and urged me to research Arabelle Thompson's rich archive. James West kindly answered my many questions at the start of this project and responded to a draft. The wonderful staff at the Hutchins Center, particularly Abby, Krishna, and Velma, make all this happen with warmth and professionalism. Scott Walker at Harvard's GIS mapping service expertly made 2 of the maps that I include here. Skip, I am more indebted to you than you know. Your work continues to inspire me daily. My fellow fellows, thank you for your kindness and commiseration. George Hutchinson, I am honored that you agreed to introduce me today. Thank you so much for your exceptional scholarship and support. And finally, I would like to thank my 2 sons, Mark and Walter, and my partner in life, Bill, who reads and responds to all of my work. Words are not enough. In February of 1952, Arabelle Thompson, acclaimed author and the first Black female foreign correspondent and managing editor of the nation's leading African-American photographic magazine, Ebony, had had enough. Having worked tirelessly since the fall of 1947, Thompson, now 42 years old, company founder John Johnson was only 28, declared that she was underpaid relative to her male colleagues and denied bylines when junior male colleagues readily got them. I am the only managing editor who has regular columns in all 3 publications, Negro Digest, Ebony, and Jet, none for which I receive credit or recognition. After pointing out how critical she had been to Ebony's rapid circulation growth and how careful she had been to follow workplace rules and budgetary constraints, Thompson emphasizes the raise and bonus double standard within the company. As the oldest employee, I share titles with and receive only $5 more than Mr. Nipson, who has been here only half as long. I think you should know, Mr. Johnson, that the weakest point in the morale of the office is the feeling that you believe a white man, likely a reference to journalist and editor Ben Burns, founding editor of Negro Digest, Ebony, and Jet, is worth more than a Negro. In an earlier draft of the letter, she threatened to quit. Although Thompson's letter seems to have inspired the notoriously penurious Johnson to co-sponsor Thompson's 18-country tour of Africa, travel was the foremost concession Thompson sought. Only 2 of the 6 articles she wrote for Ebony, however, included her byline. And even though she survived multiple rounds of Johnson Company firings to become one of the longest-lasting Johnson Company employee editors, the importance of her work to the African-American literary canon is today largely forgotten. I begin with this anecdote because it reflects Thompson's struggle for recognition, the centrality of travel to her work, and her acute awareness of gender and racial bias, even within a black network of power. In turn, the quasi-erasure of Thompson's legacy reflects both the dismissal of popular modern magazines as part of what Frederick Jameson has called degraded commodity art, and what E. Franklin Frazier famously declared was Ebony's creation of a world of make-believe in which the black bourgeoisie live. Although the recent work of Adam Green, E. James West, Jonathan Fenderson, James T. Campbell, and Aisha Hardison are notable exceptions, most scholars of the Cold War period have yet to consider Thompson's work as part of the black literary canon. Author of an autobiography, American Daughter, an African travelogue, Africa, Land of My Fathers, and foreign correspondent and managing editor of Ebony for almost 40 years, she played a key role in defining Cold War black writing. Although her writing at the time was widely praised, conceived and marketed as a direct response to Richard Wright's Native Son, his autobiography Black Boy, and and Gold Coast travelogue Black Power, she is not even mentioned in most studies or anthologies of the period, including the Norton Anthology for African American Literature, Jesse McCarthy's The Blue Period, Black Writing in the Early Cold War, Stephen C. Tracy's A Writing of the Black Chicago Renaissance, or Darlene Clark Hine and John McCluskey's The Black Chicago Renaissance. Nor was her work included in the Chicago Art Institute's 2025 exhibition, Project of a Black Planet, The Art and Culture of Pan-Africa, a rather stunning omission considering Chicago-based Ebony's central role in popularizing a Pan-African consciousness. Part of that semi-erasure was likely due to the apparently light, optimistic tone of American Daughter, which seemed out of step with the urgency of civil rights efforts to combat post-World War II white supremacist violence and segregation. As African Americans, soldiers returned home following World War II, lynchings of black veterans and other white violence swept the South. Even after the 1948 Shelley versus Kramer decision declared racially restricted covenants unenforceable, Chicago's brutally overcrowded, rodent-infested kitchenettes became, in the words of Imani Morrison, shorthand for the lethal racial capitalism operating on Chicago's South Side. Although most reviews of American Daughter were positive, two pillars of black African American literature further marginalized her work. Harlem Renaissance novelist Arthur Bontemps extolled what he saw as Thompson's cross-racial hopefulness, her, quote, cheerful and warm-hearted autobiography. Yet his praise, such simple wisdom and virtue combined with so pleasant a quality of self-expression, especially within the context of Richard Wright's searing social realism, suggested the lightness of mere diversion. Ralph Ellison offered a direct, damning appraisal. In his review entitled Stepchild Fantasy, Ellison concludes, quote, it would be a mistake to take American Daughter as a serious contribution either to American biography or to the rising discussion over the damaging effect of our system of race relations upon Negro personality and our democratic health. Arabelle Thompson's work, however, deserves reappraisal, not only because her lyricism about the American prairie rivals that of Willa Cather, and her displacement of Jim Crow trauma reveals a fascinating strategy of Cold War dissemblance, but also because her depictions of domestic and international travel and attempted travel via train, car, and airplane across state, national, and continental boundaries offer a unique window into the fight for Cold War civil rights. Thompson saw travel, especially automobile travel, not only in the words of Cotton Seiler, as an expression of her desire and fitness for citizenship, a practice that fused self-determination and self-representation, mobility, consumption, and social encounter, but also as a means of at once testing, exposing, and escaping Cold War Jim Crow, while promoting a guarded Ebony model of black liberalism. In the process, Thompson defines Cold War civil rights through the travel test, shifting the South-North map of the Great Migration to the east-west map of U.S. tourism and ultimately to the west-south-north map of African homecoming. And here you see the map that Scott Walker very kindly made for me. She's born in Des Moines. The family moves to Bismarck. She grows up she grows up here in North Dakota on homesteading. She gets her degree in Sioux City. She graduates from Morningside College in Sioux City. And then you see her travels from the East Coast to the West Coast. Using travel and mapping as both theme and metaphor, I argue that Arabelle Thompson's work is critical to understanding the Chicago Black Renaissance, early African-American Cold War writing, and the development of a 1950s Pan-African, New Africa, New Negro consciousness. Ralph Ellison, whose parents migrated to what was then Oklahoma in Indian Territory, wrote that for African Americans, geography is fate, and in moving west, his family sought a land of opportunity. The Thompson family likewise moved west, specifically North Dakota, in the late teens, hoping to find, quote, a new home in the wide open spaces where there was freedom and equal opportunity. Historians Taya Miles and Sharon P. Holland argue that by the late 19th century and early 20th century, many African Americans had come to see the Western lands, called Indian Territory, as a refuge in America, and more as a potential black space that would function metaphorically and emotionally as a substitute for the longed-for African homeland. The very notion of a visionary politics in African American culture they maintain is inextricably tied to an idea, imaginary or realized, of Indian nations and territory as open and even marginal space, a psychic territory where Black subjects find safety, solace, autonomy, and family. Upon first coming to North Dakota, which, although never a part of Indian Territory, is home to 5 tribal nations, Thompson describes the vast prairie through her father's eyes as infused with a divine presence rather than clearly demarcated lines of ownership. It was a strange and beautiful country my father had come to. So big and boundless, he could look for miles and miles out over the golden prairies and follow the unbroken horizon where the midday blue met the bare peaks of the distant hills. No tree or bush to break the view, miles and miles of prairie haylands, acre after acre of waving grain, and up above, God and that fiery chariot which beat remorselessly down upon the parching earth. This was God's country. There was something in the vast stillness that spoke to the man's soul, and he loved it. Later, after her mother dies and her father and brother become increasingly disillusioned with the relentless, back-breaking labor of homesteading, Arabelle, alone among her family members, claims the North Dakota farmland as a site of solace, multi-ethnic fusion, artistic inspiration, and an empowering coming of age. I loved the long, solitary ride through the golden autumn sunshine during the brief North Dakota fall when the day stood still and the warm silence was unbearable in its poignant beauty. Sometimes I tied the reins to the seat and ate the shiny coffee-colored flax seeds or scooped them up in my palms and let them run through my fingers like millions of tiny sequins. When I came to the elevator, I carefully drove the load up the steep ramp onto the scales to be weighed and dumped. The horses needed no urging going home. I talked to them through the twilight above the rumble of the empty wagon. I sang my German songs or recited Little Gottlieb. And sometimes I sat silently on a high seat or stood down in the bottom of the deep wagon, drinking in the full glory of white sage against purple shadows, watching gold-streaked heavens turn blue with approaching light. At home, I unhitched and tended my own horses before joining the threshers at the table. I was a big girl now. Have adopted some of the language and customs of her German neighbors as she observes the twilight sunset along the horizon, Thompson revels in a moment of an unbounded West where she communes across across culture, race, gender, and even species. By contrast, Thompson describes Chicago, where she lives and works after the death of her father through the spatial movements she can and cannot make, both alone and with white company. In the notes she made for American Daughter, she compared feeling like a despised minority in Chicago rather than as an individual on the plains. When a white college friend visits her, she writes, I wanted to take her to a nice cafe in the Loop, but there were many places I couldn't go. I was ashamed. Only in Washington Park, on the cool grass, and under the pure blue sky, under the whispering trees, no shadow of race would come between us. For Thompson, the multi-ethnic West, and in particular, historically nomadic peoples like the Sioux, offer sites of personal reinvention. Earlier in American Daughter, Thompson emphasized that she was a product of that ethnic fusion. In father's mulatto veins flowed also the blood of a Dutchman, a Frenchman, and a couple of Indians. Immediately before Thompson makes her foray into journalism, she describes attending a rodeo in Mandan, the beginning of the real West, she says. The Indians come from the reservations to greet the tourist trains and dance at the big rodeo. Among the Indians, Thompson befriends a Sioux girl, Priscilla, and articulates her reinvented self, first as a second-generation immigrant. My mother don't speak American, said the girl. This is Priscilla. Old country, I thought. Only it wasn't old country. It was this country. Nearly all my friends were second generation. Their parents spoke the mother tongue, wore the native clothes, had the ways of the fatherland, even the Indians. In a sense, I was second generation too, only Pop had no other language, and in the waves of the world was far ahead of me. My Latin and geometry didn't make any more sense to my father than they did to their fathers. Seeing her access to education as one of the markers of her second-generation immigrant status, Thomas envisions the West as largely free from the brutal Jim Crow barriers that characterize Chicago. Thompson writes herself into the landscape of North Dakota homesteading, using the U.S. frontier and Midwest Northern European immigrant towns as sites to reinvent herself in defiance of dominant conceptions of race, ethnicity, gender, and size. Arabelle Thompson was 4'11". Her ebony obituary lists her as 4'8". And even immigration status, as she uses travel in her post-World War II search for full citizenship rights. In an Indian powwow for tourists Thompson attends, she describes herself as both observer and participant. I love the Indian war dances. Every evening they gathered in front of the grandstand in the twilight, dressed in all their fine feathers and elk's teeth and beaded moccasins. The chiefs and the warriors wearing long headdresses and carrying fierce hatchets in their fringed buffalo pants. Beneath the war paint was gentleness and a quiet joy in their make-believe. The dance was a picturesque thing, weird and exotic. A tall brave would step out into the center of the chanting circle, head bent low, knees pumping high, dancing to the throb of the tom-toms. A strenuous dance it was, punctuated by blood-curdling yells, a dance that raised beads of sweat on his naked brown back, made his makeup run down his high cheeks. While the bucks danced, I often joined the squaws in a smooth little sidestep around the edge of the circle until some brash individual asked what tribe I belonged to, the Crows or the Blackfeet. This passage is striking in part because Thompson at once acknowledges, as Philip Deloria argues, that Native people had turned in the first decades of the 20th century to playing Indian, miming Indianness back at Americans in order to redefine it, even as she ignores how such performances reflected at once Indian dispossession and otherness. Nor does Thompson question her own right to participate in the dance. Having recoded her blackness as incorporating white ethnic, African, Native American, and Asian strands, she stakes her claim as fundamentally a part of a Western frontier melting pot, giving herself permission to perform alternative identities. Almost immediately after she participates in the war dance, she reinvents herself as Dakota Dick, a bad, bad cowboy from the wild and woolly West in a series of tongue-in-cheek 1924 and 1925 contributions to the Chicago Defender's Light and Shadows column. And so you can see her contribution is right here. Okay, so she's Dakota Dick. Thompson writes, I'm the foreman of a 9-section ranch owned by Badlands Bill McCarthy. What's more, I got the handsomest map in the outfit. Can ride 'em scared, dead, dying, or hypnotized. In another column, she says she's been trapping coyotes and hunting buffalo, and declares that she is a man in body, but a woman at heart. Quickly, Dakota Dick became a popular persona in the column. Thompson deflects and reveals her real identity in verbal play with other column contributors. And yet, prior to the scene of playful, celebratory Western masquerade and seemingly antithetical to the novel's theme of unity and racial reconciliation, Thompson describes a brutal act of white mob violence so visceral and so distinctly emblematic of white supremacist claims of public space that, I argue, it must be displaced. In the chapter entitled Our Land, Thompson vividly recalls her brother Dick sending the family a copy of the Chicago Defender, the first black newspaper she had ever seen, during the Red Summer of 1919. On the front page was a large picture of a Negro hanging from a tree, followed an account of a Southern lynching and all of its diabolical horror, of a man being dragged behind a speeding car through the streets of the Negro section, past his own home, of the mutilating of his body, of final death from a rope to the jeers of the mob, of flames licking his nude body and white men and women cutting off burned black fingers, burned black ears to carry home in gory triumph, souvenirs for their young. The passage is a horrific inverse of vacation travel as democratic freedom, where the automobile, a symbol in 1919 of modernity, affluence, and mobility, and a gathered crowd eager for excitement and souvenirs for their children, now signify the brutal lengths to which white supremacist mobs will go to demonstrate their control of black people in public space and on the road. Thompson responds by seeing the spectacle lynching as characteristic of a degraded, godless civilization she wants to escape among the prairies and expansive skyline. She writes, I wanted never to leave my prairies with white clouds of peace and clean blue heavens, for now I knew that beyond the purple hills, prejudice rode hard on the heels of promise, and death was its overtaking. And I wondered, where was God? Within the larger context of the novel, however, the scene at first reads as a flashbulb traumatic memory in an overall optimistic narrative where her athletic prowess overcomes interpersonal prejudice, where a white Methodist minister adopts her into his family so that she can graduate from Suicide's Morningside College, and where, in her autobiography's last chapter, My America Too, she reaps her ultimate reward for her American work ethic when her coworkers gift her money for cross-country train travel. She writes, I toured Los Angeles, visited famous and fabulous Hollywood, and spent a glorious day at Mount Wrigley's beautiful Santa Catalina Island, where lazy seals sunned themselves upon rocky shores, where fantastic tropical fish swam in submarine gardens, and where seahorses and flying fishes frolicked in a warm turquoise sea, and hamburgers were 25 cents. Famous, fabulous, fantastic, and frolicking, the sightseeing destinations of the West Coast seem to have completely overridden the trauma of what she had read in the Chicago Defender from 1919. Given the context in which Thompson was writing, such repression is not surprising. As a recipient of a Newberry Library scholarship, Thompson certainly faced pressure from her white benefactors and the University of Chicago Press to craft her book as an optimistic alternative to Wright's native son. And yet, I argue, it's a mistake to discount Thompson's work as disengaging from civil rights protest. Just a few pages before the lynching scene, Thompson recalls her brother wringing the neck of a chicken he found floundering around outside the coop, its feet frozen. He returns with the dead chicken and its bloody head. Arabelle rushes out of the house and out into the frigid winter in terror. And when her brother implores her to re-enter the house, she returns and feels, quote, something wet and soft touch my hand. The bloody head of the chicken, with its beady eyes and frozen comb, hung suspended from a string before my eyes. For a minute, I could not move. I could not speak. The bones in my legs turned to rubber. My head swam. A hot wave of nausea swept over me. Thompson renders the butchered chicken and the lynching news as the only two moments of terror in her narrative. But while the lynching appears textually forgotten, the gore of the chicken killing causes a lifelong fear of feathers, which reappears in a particularly fraught moment in her 1954 travelogue, Africa, Land of My Fathers. With the scene's proximity, similar imagery of bloody killing suspended and brought home, a place of purported refuge, the terror of the bloody chicken and the lynching description are inextricably linked, an act of psychological and rhetorical displacement that contain Thompson's safer fear of feathers within the confines of a Cold War Black liberal narrative. Thompson's decision in American Daughter to downplay white racial violence in favor of emphasizing a united America, in retrospect, served her well, not only in robust sales, but also in a job offer that would define her career. Seeing Thompson's American Daughter in accord with his post-World War II vision for Johnson Company publications, where consumer capitalism, epitomized by leisure travel, and civil rights progress went hand in hand, John Johnson offered her a job. Thompson recalled later that she had only one question for Johnson: will I travel? So here she is in the 1950s, and here she is. This is a kind of famous photograph of her on the Ebony staff. And what I find ironic is she's often compared to Wright in reviews, and she's holding the magazine issue with a very controversial Wright piece called "The Shame of America." So this is the 1951 article. With its emphasis on relaxation Ebony in turn used travel to demonstrate integration progress, offer practical Green Book advice, emphasize Black wealth and modernity, especially as air travel gets increasing coverage, and by the early 1950s to encourage a Black diasporic consciousness while presenting readers the promise of an oasis from Jim Crow. And so here are some of the travel images in Ebony. And what I found striking is many of them will emphasize, vacation spots as an oasis from Jim Crow. So this one is Ready to Reach Paradise, this is by Langston Hughes, offers perfect prejudice-free vacation spot. The low-cost tour features no Jim Crow travel, all right? And this is Florida. And then increasingly, the destinations get further and further away. And you see increasing ads for the airplane, again, signifying kind of wealth and modernity. And here is a European, emphasizing European travel. And then finally, the summer resort. With its emphasis on relaxation near bodies of water, suggesting the break of white supremacist pollution taboos, desegregated vacations become for Ebony the ultimate sign of race relations progress. As Jane West argues, even though Negro Digest and Ebony advertise themselves as of and by and for Negroes, Johnson emphasized the value of his magazine as vehicles for interracial understanding, published letters by white readers, and endorsed extensive advertising campaigns in mainstream white periodicals such as the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. In other words, Johnson Publishing aggressively sought to, quote, sell white readers the idea that a Negro magazine is worth buying. As Jane Campbell notes, white mainstream publications, including Reader's Digest and Times, two pillars of post-war anti-communism, routinely cited Ebony's stories to demonstrate Negro progress in the United States. Although such appeals to interracial understanding carried risk, in 1947, Alabama Senator John Sparkman used an Ebony article to demonstrate that President Harry S. Truman's proposed civil rights legislation wasn't needed. They were a critical part of Johnson's effort to assuage government officials that his publication was not a threat. Certainly Johnson, whose Negro Digest had been flagged by the California Committee on Un-American Activities in 1948 as, quote, communist initiated and controlled, or so strongly influenced as to be in the Stalin solar system, was well aware of the risks of appearing to sympathize with the leftists, especially because Ebony editor Ben Burns and Ebony writer Richard Wright had at one time been members of the Communist Party. In a July 1953 memo, the American consulate called, quote, Mr. Johnson of the Johnson Publishing Company a card-carrying communist since 1932. Johnson himself steadfastly sought to court government approval, going so far as to recruit FBI's J. Edgar Hoover in 1945 to write an article for Ebony. And in October 1947, Ebony published a celebratory article on Negro G-men, Agent Johnny Amos, and aide to, which featuring Agent Johnny Amos and aide to Hoover, Sam Noisette. And so you see Sam Noisette is his, Hoover's assistant is right there. Producing a successful black magazine empire during the Red Scare would mean a careful negotiation of civil rights and anti-communist rhetoric, especially given that some of the most famous black celebrities of the era Ebony covered had committed themselves to the left. As Mary Duzak argues, because the US government was keenly conscious of how communist governments used the brutality of Jim Crow in recruitment throughout the developing world, the US government insisted that civil rights discourse fit within a story of progress, a story of the triumph of good over evil, a story of US moral superiority. Even as the Red Scare destroyed lives and ruined careers, the Cold War delimited civil rights discourse, curtailing political activism that questioned American intervention around the world. African independence movements, in turn, were often perceived as either communist-influenced or vulnerable to the communist influence, and therefore a threat to the United States. To silence the voices of leftist civil rights proponents, the House Committee on Un-American Activities and the US government's loyalty security program routinely confiscated passports. As William J. Maxwell notes, the FBI strategy of restricting black travel as a means of repressing what it saw as radical black political movements had its roots in its campaign against Marcus Garvey. Paul Robeson's passport was revoked in 1950, a fact which Ebony included. W. Du Bois, of course, had his passport revoked from 1952 to 58. And while collecting material for Black Power, the book that he intended to write on the ascendancy of Kwame Nkrumah, who had been elected Prime Minister of the Gold Coast in 1952, and his Socialist Convention People's Party, CPP, Richard Wright reported to the American consulate what he learned about the CPP and about his friend and confidant, George Padmore's secret means of communicating with Nkrumah. Historian Carol Polsgrove speculates that his primary rationale for collaborating with American authorities was the fear of losing his passport and having to leave Paris. In December of 1951, Jet, in an article likely authored by Thompson, reported that Robeson had applied for a special passport to present at the United Nations General Assembly in Paris because Robeson's passport was confiscated by the State Department. Thompson, in other words, was well aware of the dangers of criticizing American intervention or praising leftist movements. If Thompson's pre-Ebony autobiography ends with celebratory cross-country travel and the prospect of a united America, her African travelogue, sponsored by both Doubleday and the Johnson Publishing Company, represents the prospect of a united and independent Africa, symbolized in part by free and safe travel within countries and across borders, as less certain. Like American Daughter, In African Land of My Fathers, Thompson writes a personal, rather than an overtly political narrative, where she speaks from direct observation. Throughout her narrative, even as Thompson cautions against European motives in Africa, documents systemic racial inequality and apartheid and the vulnerability of Black women worldwide to sexual assault, she applauds the post-war World War II liberal order of American investment in Africa and relishes the bird's-eye view of air travel historically privileged by the masculine colonizer gaze. 2 months in Africa had made me feel more at home in the air than on land, and far more welcome, she writes. Travel, and in particular air travel, is a dominant theme in Thompson's account because it signified international Black civil rights progress, African modernization and independence, her rights as an American citizen, consumer, and racial representative. While traveling in West Africa, Thompson envisions herself as a consummate new Negro woman in an emerging new Africa. By the time she reaches South and East Africa, however, old stereotypes and white supremacist regimes of power have taken center stage. In retrospect, Thomas viewed her first African tour as a breakthrough for Black female journalists. In an oral history she gave in 1978, she recalls, "On my first trip to Africa in 1953 as a Black American woman journalist, I was taboo in both African and colonial officials. As an editor, 90% of my mail was addressed to Mr. Thompson. In Ethiopia, a Black journalist did not bother to meet my plane because he thought the magazine editor was a man. Being sent all that distance for a story, I must be white. He got quite a shock when he met me." Thompson begins Africa, Land of My Fathers by emphasizing that her narrative represents a turning point in African-American Pan-African consciousness, Western investment opportunities, and African independence movements. So this, again, thank you to Sam Walker for making this map, but you can see she starts, of course, in Liberia, and she makes her journey into South and then up to East Africa, and then flies out back to Europe through Cairo. She acknowledges how she had, throughout her life, internalized the anti-Black racism of her era that associated Africans with savagery, gullibility, and cannibalism. Quote, Congo swamps and voodoo incantations. Quote, I grew up believing that Black was bad, that Black was dirty and poor and wrong. Black was Africa. I did not want to be an African. World War II, Thompson writes, served as a catalyst for recentering Africa and American consciousness as a site of investment, inspiration, emancipatory fervor, brutal repression of its Black citizens, and an ongoing struggle for liberation. With the loss of Asian colonies, Europe was looking to the gold, diamonds, and uranium in them their African hills. America was also looking toward Africa for a new land, air bases, and strategic raw materials. The African himself was demanding to be heard, and the same wave of nationalism that set brown Asia free was knocking on Black Africa's door. I just want to show you a couple other images. So 1953 was a big year in the coverage of Africa. So these are both covers, of course, Nkrumah, Life magazine, and this would, of course, influence Ebony tremendously. And here's the cover of her book. Thompson describes herself as a prodigal daughter, returning to the land of my forefathers after 300 years and among the few millions other American Negroes taking new interest and growing pride in the motherland. To make her case for a popularized new Africa of growing African independence forged by Western-educated Black leaders, she includes key elements of the Ebony formula: film references, American historical comparisons, Black African success stories, Black ancestral pride, celebrity sex appeal, and African fashion and beauty. She begins her travels in Liberia, which she calls Little USA, and looking through the airplane window evokes the same divine presence she recalled her father feeling on first seeing North Dakota. Quote, it was growing late when I first saw it, a small patch of land spilling out into the Atlantic, red-brown and desolate. Just from the Sahara Desert below, fused with the rays of the Atlantic, fused with the rays of the tired sun to form a brown haze around the horizon. A star burst boldly through the stratosphere as white cloud banks marched silently by the window of my plane. Akin to the strange and beautiful American prairie with God and that fiery chariot, the Liberian starburst recalls her North Dakota vision. Together, both read as a divine blessing and guidance to her homecoming, to this visit to the first nation, African nation, to gain independence. At the same time, she emphasizes repeatedly the benefits of U.S. aid in Black progress, race relations, and African development, especially in her hailing of pioneering African-American photojournalist Griff Davis and the work of the International Development Point 4 program. And so this is Griff Davis. And here's Arabelle Thompson. She's 54 at this moment. Taking its name from President Harry S. Truman's 1949 inaugural address, where his fourth point was to make the benefits of America's scientific and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas. The Point 4 program, a precursor to USAID, according to Thompson, gave Liberia the free port of Monrovia, the finest harbor of the west coast of Africa, and the only free port south of the Sahara. When the director of the Point 4 in Liberia, John W. Davis, a position never held before by a Negro, invites her to a dinner buffet, Thompson marvels at the whites from the Deep South as they mingle freely and socially with Negroes. Thompson reprints Liberian President William S. Tubman's letter to black readers, which defines new Negroes as those who have experienced some awakening of thought, where the Negro race feels some obligation not only toward the people of Liberia, but also to all of Africa. A key component of that awakening would be the fulfillment of a strong feeling of spiritual connection to the continent. Thompson next travels to Ife in Nigeria, to the purported site of the Garden of Eden, sacred city of the Yorubas. Here indeed was proof of the African cultural practices, priceless art fashioned by the black hands many centuries ago. If these were my ancestors, I had reason to be proud. Her Ebony article presents Ife as a site of human and biblical origin stories, an assertion supported by the famed anthropologist Louis Leakey, who quibbles only on the original African site for the Garden of Eden. The article emphasizes the merging of British and African expertise, the heavenly descent of Ife's Oni, the city's wealth, and artistic treasures now claimed by local museums rather than looted.
Right next to Hair Street.
Yes. Exactly. Ebony includes this pilgrimage to Ife, but like most of the articles coming from Thompson's work, without her byline. In fact, the only photograph of the 50-year-old Thompson that Ebony does include, advertising her journey to Africa, emphasizes her small size, so small, in fact, that she can fit in an African cooking vessel. And here you see, so that's right here. So that was the picture taken by, the photograph taken by Griff Davis.
I thought it was the other one.
Oh, no. In Lagos, Nigeria, Thompson explicitly defines the new Africa as having bridged the developing and developed world. Here were the real Africans who had never been away from their motherland. And the new Africans who, educated in the ways of the Western world, were demanding control of their country, were already assuming the responsibilities of leadership. In her chapter, Gold Coast Glamour Boy, Kwame Nkrumah, who had asked Thompson to ghostwrite his autobiography, and at one point she says made a pass at her, epitomized the new Africa because he was using his American education at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania to help his people. Ebony magazine, in turn, celebrated Nkrumah's cosmopolitanism. The June 1952 issue of Ebony extols the emergence of Nkrumah and other pipe-smoking, cultivated African leaders who wore Bond Street tweeds and carried briefcases is gradually changing U.S. Negro opinions of Africa. His convention, People's Party, would appear in the pages of Ebony not as socialist, but as a, quote, upstart government with its emphasis on the common man. Both Tubman and Nkrumah would epitomize a new African consciousness represented in Ebony as a means of generating black wealth. In the June 1953 photo spread, World's Top Negro Statesmen Meet, a meeting which occurred in February of 1953, emphasizes American business investment in Africa. Tubman and Nkrumah's personal wealth in the form of Tubman's $1 million yacht, and Ebony appears to have doubled the value of the yacht. Most sources put the yacht's value at $500,000. Nkrumah's gold gifts to Tubman, Nkrumah's power as he snubs the British ambassador, and Africa's mineral wealth and travel networks. As an American daughter, and here you see, this is where he's snubbing the British ambassador. So Nkrumah is right here. the ambassadors sitting by himself. As an American daughter, Thompson sees the global West as a site of gender transgression and black freedom. But as her narrative progresses and she journeys south and east in Africa, her movement becomes more impeded. Increasingly, readers witness the triple consciousness of her position as a black American female journalist as Thompson expresses growing frustration with her purported homeland. What Brent Hayes Edwards has theorized and Nadia Nur Hussein has summarized as the décalage, or spatial and temporal lag, embedded in the idea of diaspora that both links and divides black people of different ethnic cultural identities. As a black woman, Thompson is both excluded from certain activities and fears sexual assault from white men, delimiting her ability to travel freely and safely in a purported new Africa. An African guide quietly counts her out of a safari. In Zimbabwe, she is denied access to see one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Great Victoria Falls, although she can hear it from the train, but they won't allow her to see it. Along the Zambezi River, because no hotels would accommodate her. On a train in South Rhodesia, Thomas overhears a conversation between white men debating the risks of black African revolt. They all agree that if a white man rapes a black woman, it's merely unfortunate, not wrong. It's bad to beget mulattoes. Thompson bolts her door and writes, "I was alone with 4 white men who had no regard for black womanhood." In Mozambique, a Portuguese immigration officer takes her passport and makes such a forceful sexual advance that Thompson wonders if she should, quote, practice up on my screaming, unquote. Freedom to travel was crucial to the vision of a new Africa, and FBI documents reveal the extent to which British and American authorities worked together to control Thompson's movements and contacts with British colonies. In October of 1902, British Governor Evelyn Baring, in an effort to subdue Mau Mau insurrectionists, had declared a state of emergency and arrested and sentenced after a show trial the moderate Kenyan constitutional nationalist Jomo Kenyatta as one of the key leaders of the uprising. As historian John Reynolds writes, the state of emergency Baring declared had not only compounded the mass arrest campaigns, preventative detention, and increasingly indiscriminate and uncompromising police operations he had already introduced against the Mau Mau and Kikuyu more broadly, but in turn inspired the Mau Mau to take up armed revolt. As David Anderson notes, if African nationalism was on the march in Africa in the 1950s, so too was white power. Many of Kenyan's white settlers hailed South Africa's National Party victory in 1948 and its imposition of apartheid as securing white minority rule increasingly under threat. Even before leaving the United States, a special agent in charge of the Chicago FBI office reported that Thompson had applied and been denied a visa to enter British possessions, and when refused was making quote unquote vigorous protests. FBI records indicate that Thompson was flagged as a potential communist threat in the US because she attended a Chicago Urban League event, which was covered by the DuSable edition of the Communist Worker newspaper. And she served as the managing editor of the Negro Digest, which the California Committee on Un-American Activities had flagged in 1948 as communist initiated and controlled, or so strongly influenced as to be in the Stalin solar system. Upon learning of Thompson's impending visit to British colonial Kenya, Governor Baring summoned the American Consul General in Nairobi, Edmund J. Dortz, and warned that the Mau Mau difficulties had given the Soviets an excellent opportunity to create trouble for the West. Having been flagged by Kenyan authorities as associating with fellow travelers, or as another memo stated, commie suspects, Arabelle Thompson, Baring insisted, and Dortz agreed, shouldn't be barred from entering. On June 16, 1953, the Nairobi-based American Consulate General Dortz entitled his dispatch to the US State Department, "Kenya Governor believes communist mechanism attempting to penetrate Kenya and establish contacts here." So here's the memo. And indicated that Kenyan Governor Baring had informed him that Kenyan authorities were quite disturbed by Thompson's presence. Thompson, interestingly, had managed to get a visa to enter Kenya in Monrovia. So Monrovia, of course, Liberia was much more friendly to her there. The same day, John A. Noon, Regional Public Affairs Officer for the United States Information Service, wrote to Dorst that if Thompson were not accorded the proper courtesies, she would more likely write negative articles, detrimental, quote unquote, to the interests of the colony and thereby indirectly, adversely affect the interests of the United States. He gave it a 50-50 chance that Thompson would write articles of value and reassured Dorst that they found her to be, quote unquote, very naive and uninformed on political matters in East Africa. Noon then proposed accompanying Thompson to all of her visits with black Kenyans. Dorst, however, was not mollified. The security situation in Kenya was too dangerous to take any chances, he wrote. Fearing she might be sympathetic to Mau Mau rebels, Dorst limited her agency to a maximum of 2 days. Noon assured Dorst that he could stall Thompson in Uganda without her growing suspicious. And once she arrived in Kenya, arranged her schedule such that she only met with, quote unquote, persons with whom the government has confidence, unquote. Yet counter to plan, Ugandan authorities, according to the Deputy Governor of Kenya, Sir Frederick Crawford, bungled the matter and informed Thompson that Kenya considered her to be undesirable, an undesirable transient who had subversive connections. Crawford urged Dorst to dissemble and reassure Thompson that Kenya had made no such determination. Yet even before Thompson had reached Uganda, she discovered that British-controlled Zanzibar had declared her a prohibited immigrant, something very loathsome, like a criminal or a communist, and forbade her entrance. It is at this point where Thompson, I argue, reveals the displaced trauma of lynching as a brutal form of white supremacist social control. Detained in Dar es Salaam, the airport there, an attendant offers to take her for a walk, where a first stop is in an African hut on the edge of a coconut forest. When a chicken appears, Thompson backs away because of a phobia of feathers. Suddenly, she feels the acuteness of décalage. And this is, she says, a black man's country, but I'm unwelcome. If I could not swim, was afraid of a chicken, and did not even speak the language of my people, I had been a member of a majority race now for 2 whole months, and frankly, I had never had it so bad. Homeland indeed, unquote. Despite knowing British authorities considered her a possible communist threat, Thompson, when she reached Kenya, embraced Dorst and Noons, the very American officials who were surveilling her, orchestrating her Kenyan interviews, and reporting back to British colony leaders about her movements. Indeed, unable to trace the source of her prohibited immigrant designation, Thompson, when she receives a message from the American consulate that she can travel to Kenya, welcomes with relief and gratitude the very men who are surveilling her. USIS Agent Noon and American Consulate General Dorst. I was no longer a woman without a country, a prohibited immigrant. The whole United States of America was behind me, thanks to the man upstairs. Even though both Jet and Ebony, like their white news counterparts, had before her departure clearly positioned Kenyatta as the face of the Mau Mau insurrection and associated the London School of Economics graduate with primitive old Africa, Thompson takes the perspective of the British coloners. And here you can see, this is an example of the Ebony's coverage of the Mau Mau. And the article is fairly sympathetic, but you see Kenyatta is being portrayed as, first of all, the leader of the Mau Mau and a vision of old Africa, kind of this primitive old Africa. Let's see. When British Kenyan politician Wilfred Havelock declares that Jomo Kenyatta's Kenya's Africa Union is definitely Mau Mau influenced, we have had spies on the inside for some time gathering evidence, Thompson recalls anxiously, I had just posed for pictures with its current leader. With the comforting presence of Noon, she reflects that the Mau Mau could easily lurk there unseen, a stone's or a panga's throw away from their back porch. Carefully shielded from any commentary on British atrocities and violations of human rights, Thompson calls the Mau Mau terrorists and a terrorist cult who were a threat to her, concentrating more on black sympathizers with whites than on whites whom they were sworn to eliminate. Upon leaving Kenya, she seems to suggest that mass removal and killing of the Mau Mau was a sign of manifest destiny, that Kenya was, quote, a white settler country whose land war with the Mau Mau was in many ways analogous with that of our American pioneers who wrested the West from the Indians. Even before she left for Africa in March of 1953, she echoed the prevailing opinion in the white press of which group was most to blame for the atrocities. She jokes, actually, with her Doubleday editor, Ken McCormick, that, quote, if the Mau Mau keep it up, there won't be anyone left in Kenya to interview. In fact, the Oxford University historian David Anderson writes the British were the brutal aggressors in this dirty war, sentencing 1,574 Kikuyu prisoners to death by public hanging, imprisoning at least 150,000, all told, in prison camps, and according to independent estimates, killing more than 20,000. And yet, on leaving Egypt on a flight to Beirut, with the bird's eye view confidence to summarize lessons from the continent she traveled, Thompson offers an alternative reading sympathetic to African independence movements throughout the continent. Speaking to an American businessman next to her, she reflects, Africa is a country of 175 million blacks, all of whom, with the exception of those living in Liberia, Ethiopia, Libya, and now Egypt, are ruled by 5 million Europeans. Everywhere in Africa that the white man has settled in large numbers, he has taken the best land and all of the natural resources. The African wants the return of his land from the European and the control of his business from the Asian. He is demanding the right to rule himself, or at least to have a proportionate representation in his country's government. He wants equal pay for equal work. He wants an end to the color bar. Thompson then, in a voice which sounds surprisingly akin to the American and European authorities vested in limiting her movements and contacts in Africa, maintains that while she has heard of no evidence of communist influence in Africa, quote unquote, the growing unrest provides fertile ground for communism. Thompson ends Land of My Fathers with the patriotism of American daughter. I am an American. I owe my loyalty and my allegiance to but one flag. I have but one country. As Ebony and Jet labeled the Mau Mau a terrorist group, and like its white news counterparts deemed the moderate Kenyan nationalist leader Jomo Kenyatta its Mau Mau leader, it relegated African uprisings inspired by European oppression and atrocities as counter to the new Africa. Before the height of the civil rights movement, with civil disobedience became the dominant means of resistance, arrest on terrorist charges was a mark of shame. The new Africa, like the new Negro, must fit narratives of progress, like the photo I end with, Arabelle Thompson and Joe Louis, in an iconic Johnson Company photograph celebrating the news of the Brown v. Board decision. Thank you all.
That was wonderful.
Thanks.
I have several things, but I want to defer to my friend, George Hutchinson. If he's watching, if we can put the camera back on him. George, would you start us off, please?
Yeah, sure. There are so many twists and turns in that paper. I wrote down about halfway through, what's the relationship between her Pan-Africanism and her embrace of America, her Americanism, my America too. And it seems that it shifts. Would that be the case? In other words, early on in American Daughter, it seems that, which was very typical for the 40s actually among black writers, she's very much emphasizing her Americanism and so forth. And she never lets that go, but it seems like there's a period when she has a greater Pan-African consciousness. But then by the end of your paper, and toward the end of her period in Kenya and so forth, she seems to be shifting back. Is that a misunderstanding, or is that the case? I mean, there are different ways in which one can reconcile a Pan-Africanist sensibility with, also a feeling of one's specific Americanness. I'm just wondering if you see a shift over time and contradictions between the two.
Thank you for the question. I think what's so striking to me in reading her work is that if she's traveling freely, she is much more likely to emphasize a kind of vision of Pan-Africanism. It's always replete with, she's always endorsing American investment, but she is much more likely to point out discrimination, inequality. It's when her movement is impeded, it's just very striking. Once she's prevented from traveling, then you see that again. I think literally there's a kind of trauma response that sets in. And what was striking to me is she immediately kind of turns to what she sees as her American rescuers there, that Noon has orchestrated, has allowed her to come into Kenya, and thank goodness for the U.S. I mean, so she seems not to see, or she, and again, I think in fairness, this is a kind of dominant narrative to see the United States really working hand in hand with the authorities that have declared her undesirable. I don't know if that, yeah.
Is that good, George?
If I can add something to
Yes.
that, I'm wondering how much gender plays into it. That is, the gender, the situation of women of her class in Africa, in various African spaces and so forth, versus in the United States. Is that also something that makes her feel more distanced from the African context?
Could you repeat that, Martha?
Oh, so George asked about the role of gender. To what extent did gender play a role? And I think it does play a role. I think it played a role, and I'd like to know how other scholars think about this. In the way, I think she dissembles quite a bit. I think she is cautious about, very cautious about revealing her political knowledge. And I think that's interpreted as naivete. At the same time, she is, I think she's discounted, as, she was kind of routinely discounted as kind of a serious having anything, and partly that's because of the Ebony affiliation, as being, offering really kind of serious commentary. At the same time, they recognize the power of these vehicles. I mean, Ebony is really, by this point in the 50s, Ebony is skyrocketing. The circulation is of the Johnson Company empire is doing very, very well. So that part, I think is very much recognized, the power of that, that voice. So I don't.
No,
Thank you.
good. Just a couple of footnotes. First of all, I love this. And I was deciding between my suggestions about where this goes. It could be an essay on its own, or it could be a chapter in a book, or it could be a book itself, really. So you have to think about that. One comparison which begs to be made is the fact that Richard Wright published Black Power in exactly the same year.
And they're reviewed together.
Yeah,
Yes.
and Wright hated Africa, Nkrumah. It's terrible. It's embarrassing, really. Not embarrassing. It's his right to. I'm putting the case too strongly, but he did not bond easily, and was keen to chart the distance between himself as an American Negro and Nkrumah and Ghanaians. There's a famous scene where someone says, "What tribe are you from?" which is very common still in Africa to African Americans. And he said, "I wouldn't know because your ancestor, meaning the black slave traders, deprived me of the right of knowing that."
Yeah.
So, and her take is much more subtle and nuanced. And I had never heard of course I'd heard of her, but I didn't know she'd published this book. A couple facts. Sudan, this is a mistake made in encyclopedias. It was Sudan that's the first black nation to decolonize itself.
Ah, thank you.
Yeah. And people get mixed up because it's Arabic, it's not in West Africa. But it was a year before. It was January 1st, 56. Then in Kruba, Ghana, the Gold Coast, in 57 was the first West Africa sub-Saharan. I'm not trying
Thank
to.
you. No, thank you.
be
Thank you very
pedantic,
much. Yeah.
And you said something about Oklahoma.
Yes.
I must admit, Oklahoma was Native It was Indian Territory.
It was, yes.
I thought you said Oklahoma wasn't part of.
No, she's never. It's just I was making a parallel, even though I mean obviously North Dakota was not Indian Territory. She defines the scene as very much embracing, her ability to enter, historically nomadic tribal expressions, cultural, performances. So, and she's always longing to see, she says, I can't wait to see Indians. I mean, that's very much a part of her consciousness of the West.
I thought, en passant, you said Oklahoma, which wasn't part of Indian Territory.
No, it was. No,
because it was.
No,
It
yes,
ju-
yes,
they just
yes.
changed.
Oklahoma was, yes, a key.
Yeah, changed the name.
Yeah.
And did you say Ellison reviewed this book
Yes, he did.
and trashed it?
And trashed it, yes.
Yeah, interesting. I would like, if you could send me that reference, I'd like to read that.
Yeah.
But I loved it, and I hope that you draw out in your book the way the ads are represented.
Yes, in my I cut this down. I do have a reading because I do have a reading of the paratext on the page, but for the talk, I was cutting that. Yes.
And this aspect of ebony, when people think of ebony, the first thing they think of is Sammy Davis Jr.'s 20 automobiles and 50 cameras, right? The way you put it, I'm paraphrasing, the fantasy, middle class fantasy.
Right. Yeah, Frazier's. Yeah.
But I think lots of scholars even are unaware of this role it played in this in the period in the Cold War, in between the Manchester Pan-African Congress of 45 and 56 and 57, because it clearly was trying to show it was trying to decolonize the American Negro mind about Africa itself, which you quoted. And E. Franklin Fraser will bring out in 56 in French, and then 57 in English, Black Bourgeoisie. And one of the things that he charges the American Negro middle class with is having imbibed the same cocktail of Tarzan images about Africa, having been completely captured by them. And this is a very important aspect of your book and what she's trying to do. By the way, that trip that she did is very difficult to do today. It's still much easier to, when I lived in Tanzania when I was 19, if you wanted to call Ghana, the calls followed the trunk lines. So the call would go to London and then come back down, right? The same way if you wanted to fly. You had to fly back to the colonizers. There were very few.
Oh, interesting.
Direct. It would be if you could find out her tickets and how she did that trip, because there wasn't Ethiopian Airlines and Kenya Airlines. This is pre-colonial, right? So I would bet she spent a lot of time flying elsewhere, hundreds and hundreds of miles, thousands of miles sometimes, in order to get hundreds of miles nearby. Another thing to bring out is that the reasons that she would encounter more problems in Southeast and East Africa is that they had settler white colonies when West Africans didn't, right? So there were very few white people ever living in Nigeria, Ghana, and those places. But in South Africa, that was the problem. When the white people showed up, they said, God clearly meant this land for us because it's too beautiful and rich for these stupid black people. And Kenya obviously had a major settler colony. It's one of the nicest climates to live in. And you probably know Caroline Elkin's book, which won the Pulitzer Prize on Mau Mau.
Yeah. Yes.
But that would be a good source too.
Yes. I have that.
We're publishing George's biography of Jean Toomer, which is magnificent, in our Black Lives series at Yale. And I would like for you to think about, we've frozen it, but a bad word to use around Harvard right now, but but we will be opening it, and it might be a really nice short bio for that series, which is handsomely rewards its authors too, so we can talk about that. But there's so much that's new and fresh, even to me, and I think that that would, the sexism in Ebony, the absence of authorial title, the difference in price, salary, the whole thing. I mean, it's just culturally rich. It's fresh on the history of Ebony. It's fresh on the Cold War. It's fresh on women, black women in anything, really, in that period. Women in the Cold War. The politics of, clitoridectomy is being debated by the Kikuyu at this time, and still is, all over Africa. So there are lots of things here that you could develop in different ways for different kinds of books, and using her as the peg that you're hanging this more complicated analysis on. On the one hand, it could be a biography of Arabelle Thompson. On the other hand, it's a biography of the American Negro vis-a-vis the African Negro, as both Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison would have put it at the time, in this crucial period between the fourth, I think, or fifth Pan-African Congress of 45 and 56 and 57, when Africa starts to be born. And do I believe that Kwame Nkrumah tried to hit on her? Abso-fucking-lutely, yes. And he would today. And so would Du Bois. Anyway, just notes.
Thank you so much.
But in no
thank
way
you so much.
meant to take away from.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It's a sign of how excited I am.
Oh, thank you.
And how much I learned.
Thank you.
But Ellison would have been jealous because he owned Oklahoma. He owned the territory. You know how it used to be in black culture. These things are only big enough for one of us, and if it's going to be me, it ain't going to be you, Arabelle. I'm the black person from the territory here.
Yeah.
But the passages you read were marvelously, novelistically written. It's
I
not
really
a book
think
of
she's
sociology.
underrated. I don't. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I think her just as a stylist, she writes beautifully. So.
And to be a woman.
Yeah.
And traveling alone, that threat of rape that she feared twice at Maputo, you said, right? And from where are the four white men on the train?
That's in Rhodesia.
That's
in Rhodesia. She's in southern Rhodesia. Yeah.
Right, and then Mobutu, she almost had to scream.
Yep.
That exists today. I mean, that's so I know it had to be horrific at that time. Yeah. She was amazing. I am like blown away. So congratulations. Questions, comments?
Thank you. This was really great. I have so many questions, but as I was telling you earlier,
we got to talk more.
Yeah, I worked for a summer in Arabelle Thompson's archives because I was really struck by Ebony Magazine's representation of Togo, which is a country that is not well represented in a lot of black periodicals on decolonization. So that's how I got interested in her work. And what struck me about what you put together today is the way you were able to pull so many different archives together. And I was wondering if you can talk about the work of putting these narratives together, because the time I was working in her archives, the way that the materials were cataloged was a little difficult to navigate for the content that I was looking for, which was specifically about Togo. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you put these stories together, the different archives you navigated, and also about the challenge of locating the different stories that she wrote for these publications, given the fact that she wasn't given bylines often, and how you are incorporating her into the literary tradition, given the fact that it's difficult to attribute specific stories that sound like her to her, given the fact that she wasn't given credit for that.
That's a good point. And she used adverbs like likely and, da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
But Togo is right next to Ghana, for those of you who don't.
Let me know if I'm answering your question, okay? So first, I want to say I wrote all this on coming here, and I cannot tell you how profoundly grateful I am for this fellowship. I could not.
You wrote last night like Harry wrote his.
I could not have done this. All of this was done in the last few months, and I am so profoundly grateful for the time. I will tell you now, there's a tremendous lag getting, I have tried to get the CIA records on Thompson. I don't know if I'll ever get them. I've been trying to get other records for Johnson Company employees, and there is a 2 or 3 year wait now.
I cannot, unfortunately, help you with the CIA and the FBI.
Because I'm very curious.
That's until Donald Trump takes over the university.
I'm very curious, and I would be stunned if she had not been contacted by the CIA. I have no evidence of that. I mean, I want to be careful, but I would like to see if there are any records. So putting it together, I mean, you know, as you know, I mean, Arabelle Thompson certainly saw herself as biography worthy. I mean, her archive is 96 linear feet. It's huge. She documented everything. She saved every receipt, and she was very meticulous about what she wrote. So we can, and by the way, it's been interesting, with Harvard did not have the digitized version of Ebony, so I had to make it. I mean, they were very kind. I mean, I had to kind of make a special request. So we have a provisional. They didn't buy it. I have provisionally for Jet and Ebony. But yeah, it's incredibly time consuming going through her archive because it's so vast.
Send me a note about that. We can arrange. It'll be bought. I'm
okay.
embarrassed to know that we hadn't bought that already.
No, they didn't have. Yeah.
That will be done.
So just, you know, it's like putting pieces together. You know, I mean, Ben Burns' archive, I don't know if you've looked in his, it's a mess. In part because it was cataloged a long time ago. A lot of this work, and I really do need to give a shout out to Jacqueline Goldsby, because she was in charge of the Mapping the Stacks project, which that incredible initiative got so many archives in Chicago, Black archives, processed for scholars. So yeah, it's like trying to put together a narrative, and even the FBI files are not in order. So you have to, try to reconstruct these narratives. So it's, yes, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's, just reaching out to people. I mean, people, again, James West has been incredibly kind and generous with his time, helping. He really, he knows all the players, all the people at Ebony, and there are a number of people who are really invested in, Ebony's history, and so, kind of teasing that out and figuring out everybody's relationship and how they're, who's doing what. And
have you had luck with the photographic archives that were bought recently?
By the Getty? Yeah, the Getty has the photographic archive.
But they're not cataloged.
They're not, yes, and my understanding is supposed to come out next year, I think. Okay.
I just happen to know that they're releasing 5,000 photographs from the Johnson archive in February.
Okay.
And that comes from Getty Publishing.
That's great.
Okay. And then, of course, you all know, if you're all in Chicago, go visit the Stony Island Arts Bank, because Theaster Gates has purchased the Ebony book archive, which is have you been there? It's fantastic. Yeah, it's fantastic. So
check on the degree that Kenyatta got. Abby just looked it up. There's a lot of confusion about whether he got a degree or not. But
I was trying. Yes.
The website says a diploma.
Okay.
And he was part of Malinowski's circle.
Okay.
And I gave a lecture about that at LSE. And
Yeah.
it was an amazing circle, because Yolanda Robeson, Paul, Arthur Lewis, who was 18 years old, shows up. Sir Arthur Lewis, the only black person to get a Nobel Prize in economics. And a couple other people. They were all there.
Okay.
It was like a new Negro salon 10 years later, with people from the left and the right, all based around this quirky anthropologist who was controversial in and of himself. And then he also studied at UCL, the University College London. But just as a footnote,
Yeah.
I still couldn't figure out what the hell he got and what a diploma was as opposed to a regular degree.
Yeah,
but he wrote Facing Mount Kenya there.
Yeah, I mean, partly what I was just stunned is that he becomes, again, across the board, just identified with the Mau Mau. I mean, as leading this, this uprising, when in fact he, recent scholarship shows he really distanced himself from the violence of the uprising. He was a moderate nationalist. So.
Yeah. Questions, comments?
thank you very much for your presentation. I happened, as you know, happened to be alive at that time when she was doing lots of her writing. You deal with 1953. What about taking her further? Johnson Publications had a tremendous presence at an event that I participated in 1966, the first Black Arts Conference Festival in Senegal. Johnson Publication had the editor of the Black Journal, which is what the Negro Digest became. Was she present at that? Black World. Was she present at that particular conference, festival in Dakar in 1966 with Hoyt Fuller, who represented Black World at that conference? And I can still remember his sitting around the bar talking to key African nationalists at that point.
It's a great question. I haven't gotten there yet in the research, but I do want to say that when I started doing this, so when I first kind of did my first kind of, dive into the archive, I knew I wanted to do something on Ebony Africa. So Ebony launched this initiative to try to break the African market and sell a version of ebony in Africa. And I thought, okay, I'll start there. That's really interesting. I'd never heard of this. And then I started doing the work, and I got the FBI files, and I just realized I've got to go back. I've got to start kind of from the beginning before I can move forward. So it's a fantastic question. I haven't gotten there yet in the research.
Great. Martha, thank you so much for this. I have a few questions,
Sure.
but a couple of them are really short. George Hutchinson asked a question earlier about, I guess, the dichotomy between the black vision of America and the black vision of Pan-Africanism. And I'm wondering, is any contradiction between the two? Is it that the Bandung Conference hadn't happened yet?
55.
Right. Is it that, or is it just Ebony's making everything politically kind of flat? I'm just wondering how you ratify that, how you make sense of, because certainly a decade later, no one would have been talking about Americanism and Pan-Africanism as kind of like something one could be, I guess you could say, or could equally embrace. So I'm just wondering, was it Ebony's editorial policy that keeps them apart, that kind of allows them to orbit each other? Or was it that this radicalization hadn't happened yet politically in the world?
Johnson was very careful to avoid any even hint of radicalism.
Yeah.
He was, West, when I was talking to James West, he was telling me that the FBI agents were coming to parties. I mean, that this was, he was, it just, that was, it was too, that would have been kind of toxic, I think he saw for the publications. I think there was a tremendous amount of pride in kind of reclaiming a black aesthetic. So I think it's a black aesthetic, a black nation, a black autonomy and leadership in Africa. At the same time, it's always, that vision of a new Africa is almost always united with American investment, all right? Or the celebration of U.S. Or the point four program, or coalitions between. I mean, again, this is part of his interracial vision. It's white scholars and black, black leaders or black. Scholars on the, coalitions on the ground. So that vision is anything that is seen to be anti-white for Ebony is going to be, is going to be suspect. I mean, if it's the Mau Mau, the Mau Mau, that's going to is way too radical. Even though, again, the article, the text is fairly sympathetic, but the photograph of Kenyatta, I would argue, is the depiction of that is not. That's the antithesis of the vision of New Africa.
And we know how many words a picture is worth.
Pardon me?
And we know
Right.
how many words a picture is
Right,
worth.
exactly. And it's a photo magazine, right? And the photo is as long as the text.
That leads to my next question.
Yeah.
Is it true that Ebony bit its logo from Life magazine?
Yes, that is true.
And where did her name Era come from? That's a very unusual name. I mean, I'm used to all kinds of...
It is, and she's continually misgendered. In fact, letters to the editor are continually referring to as Mr. Thompson, which might have in some ways served her well. But I don't.
You haven't heard of any other
I don't know,
errors
but
and
she
you
was
don't
called
know what
Tommy as a kid. It's kind
Oh
of
my
interesting.
goodness.
I found that the cross gender, the kind of gender transgression in her work is really interesting. So,
Thank you, Martha.
right, yeah.
Yeah. Martha, thanks for the great talk. I really learned a lot from it. And it's an interesting intervention in this Cold War civil rights debate. And I think if it's a book, I think it'd be an interesting companion to something like Mary Helen Washington's The Other Blacklist, which I think we talked about. I guess my question is just about how to interpret that debate, given your story here. Jacqueline Dowd Hall has this kind of take on it that, most historians have treated the kind of navigation of that Cold War landscape amongst African American liberals as strategic, it's kind of silencing on foreign policy and distancing themselves from the left. I guess the question is, kind of in dialogue with Hall, is civil rights in that period a product of the Cold War or a casualty, do you think?
I think it's both. It's both. I think she dissembles. I think she's cautious. She was also had the reputation of being one of the conservative members of the Ebony editorial staff. They used to joke. The joke was that Ben Burns was the white Mau Mau on the staff of Ebony, and that she was the one that would kind of have the caution. So part of that. I think it's a push, but travel again. I'd really like to recenter travel as part of this narrative of in the Cold War civil rights movement. I think the ability to travel over borders for Black people and especially a Black woman safely is for her. That is really a mark of pushing the boundaries of her citizenship and civil rights, and her rights. So, and at the same time, of course, yes, it's definitely a pulling back. And that's what I was trying to show with the representation of the Mau Mau. At no point does she kind of step back and say, hey, gosh, maybe there's something more to this story. She is so relieved to be allowed to be in Kenya that she, that narrative. And I was, again, so struck that she's comparing the Mau Mau with Native Americans. Again, in a story of almost this kind of almost manifest destiny. Well, these are the march of progress. They're going to be kind of wiped out. So it's both. It's both, and it's conflicted. And I agree though with Maxwell, William Maxwell, when he argues. These travel restrictions really did slow down civil rights initiatives. They're just on, Du Bois not being able to travel from 52 to 58. There are definitely delays and ways in which initiatives were held back.
And long before digital media of any kind.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But the civil rights movement used the emergence of freedom and the progress of decolonization in Africa for its own political purposes, right?
Yeah.
One, if they could do it, we could do it.
Right.
One, if they could do it, we could do it, because people still believed the American Negro was the vanguard of the Negro peoples.
Right.
Which is a very embarrassing aspect of African American intellectual history, but it's absolutely the case. Du Bois in 45, and Banj sends a speech and says, before this, I can imagine that there were enough Africans sufficiently educated actually to run the continent.
Yeah.
And I want to
Yeah.
apologize. I can't remember if Du Bois was there and said a speech or not.
Yeah.
But and the other thing was the embarrassment of racism manifesting itself in the Jim Crow South to the image of America. That was also used. So that was a
Right.
sort of flip
Right.
side
Right.
usage of representation, international representation of blackness, as it were, to facilitate the progress of
Right.
the movement.
Right.
But again, black Americans were deeply ambivalent about traditional Africa. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
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 We got a final?
Two final.
Two finals. Two
thoughts?
finals. We got finals.
Martha, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
I learned so much. This is so fascinating. I have a question about genre. I'm really interested in how people choose genre in like their self-representation. So I'm just curious about what you think the sort of genre of the magazine did for her, or kind of, do you think it held her back in some ways? You know, how does that genre compare to like a newspaper? It's something that's like maybe a faster publication. Just a kind of your reflections on what that genre did for her.
It's an interesting question. I've been struck with, I think that part of what I'm seeing is that Ebony needs Pan-African, the visual Pan-African aesthetic to be, well, I should say not aesthetic, the visual Pan-African leadership to be male. I think it's significant that she, even though, all right, there is that, they say her book's coming out, but she is diminished. We have this tiny, she's kind of cute in the vessel, she's singing the vessel. And all the photographs in these essays, I mean, black women appear, but they're almost always as spouses, and they're almost always peripheral. So, and she writes 6 articles. 6 articles come from this tour. 2 of them have bylines, and she never gets a first person in these. I mean, all of her accounts, she's not garnered the first person position, right? She's not given that. Whereas Richard Wright, other writers are given that position. So yeah, I do think, I think it's the emphasis on celebrity and sex appeal. She was very aware that she was not deemed to be, sexy, and she writes about that in her journals, and that she in some ways she's kind of counter to the very aesthetic that Ebony is selling and is promoting, and
As they point out with the ads, right next to her.
right. So. At the same time, as it progresses, I think she, by the 60s, she's getting more agency. I haven't really gone there yet, but I don't know if I answered your question. But I think in that sense, yes. What's ironic is I actually think she had kind of more. It's in the Defender. I think she had more playful. You get more of a sense of her voice and the playfulness. There was actually a little bit more in the newspaper than in Ebony, which is where the voice is more cultivated, you might say, or it's more bounded, right? There's more ideological divergence in the Defender. Well, I don't want to say generic. I mean, I don't want to kind of flatten out Ebony. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things going on in there, but it's definitely more tightly controlled.
Well, and there are no pictures in her columns in the Defender.
Right. Yeah.
The difference.
Right.
She could be a man, which she pretended to be.
Yeah.
Right. Final question.
The final question has been withdrawn.
Oh.
Oh.
Oh no.
Are you sure? Well, people are hungry. That's why.
Thank you,
first of all,
everybody, for coming.
First of all, I'd like to thank my friend George Hutchinson for
Thank you.
flying in, zooming in from Ithaca.
Dude, I enjoyed it. Yeah, this
Yeah.
is great. The discussion too. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. You ought to hang out here more, brother. Check it out.
Yeah, I
And
should.
but most of all, Martha H., my co-conspirator, the queen of the new Negro, Martha H. Patterson.
Wow.
Give it up for Martha on a
Thank you,
brilliant,
George.
brilliant.
Thanks very much,
presentation.
George.
That was great. Really, I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Now let's eat.